We tried to get a couple local authors in. Last month we had Tony Colella, and we were very fortunate to have Gustav Niebuhr this Sunday. Gustav had a recent book that he wrote just a couple of years ago that he's going to talk about, and Lincoln's Bishop, and it's a very interesting book that gives the details of what was going on in the mid to late 1850s, 60s, as people started moving west, and what was going to happen to the Native Americans, the indigenous tribes. This is a great way of Gustav's presentation as far as this goes. At the same time, his book, this is my copy, he has some for sale. I know that the group that he brought were already snapped up. The proceeds are all going to go to mission, and we've designated the trip to Puerto Rico this next summer as the gift for the mission. So your contributions will be well received. If you want to sign up for a book later, we have a list over there, and we'll get your name and then get the books delivered. There's a donation, as I mentioned. Everything is going to mission, and we're certainly gratified for anything that you take. After I read the book, I was wondering what else was involved, and at the book sale this past summer at the library had, I found a book called A Good Year to Die, which is a little bit more detail of the Sioux uprising, and it ends with essentially Custer's last stand. And it's an excellent book. I have it. If anybody would like to borrow it, it's 20 years old, so I don't think you're going to find it in print too much. We sell it up. We find an awful lot of old books at that library sale. But I'll put it over on the table. You can take a look at it, and if you want to borrow it, certainly go ahead. Gustav, you're all set here? Ready to go? Welcome. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you, Dave. It's a delight, real delight to be here, and something I've been looking forward to. I want to begin with something that is not totally focused on this book, but it's just something that I feel called upon to say, a quotation which I think is pertinent to the moment and also has some utility in terms of the book, and that is this, that it was once said that man's capacity for justice makes democracy possible. Man's inclination to injustice makes democracy necessary. So, on with the book. Lincoln's Bishop, where did this come from? It came basically out of a speech that I gave in Watertown, New York, on my first book. And the person who invited me up there, the newspaper editor, who invited me to speak at Jefferson Community College, and I got there a little early. He said, I'll point out some of the landmarks that relate to famous people up here. And one of them that he mentioned was a man named Henry Whipple. And I said, I don't recognize that name. And he said, well, he was a local man who became the first bishop, Episcopal Bishop of Minnesota, and he went to see Abraham Lincoln to intercede on behalf of Dakota Sioux Indians in Minnesota in the early 1860s. When you put those things together right away, I had never heard about this. This young bishop meeting with Lincoln during the Civil War to intercede on behalf of Native American tribes. There seemed to be a story there. And so when I got back to SU, I began pursuing that story. And this is where it led me. The main figure in the story is Bishop Henry Benjamin Whipple, who was born in Adams, New York in 1822. He set out to be a businessman like his father, but underwent a conversion in the 1840s. Did very well as an Episcopal rector in Rome, New York, so well, as a matter of fact, that a group of businessmen who were, Episcopal businessmen who were starting a church in Chicago, which at that time, the 1850s, was going great guns, came east to try to find someone for this church. They wanted someone who was creative and hardworking and innovative, and because they wanted someone to minister to the railroad men, whose population was booming in Chicago on the eve of the Civil War. That's where all the railroads in the nation connected. They found Reverend Whipple in Rome at that time, persuaded him to come to Chicago and become someone who would minister to the railroad men and the railroad companies. And about the time he arrived, and he made quite an impression in Chicago, there was a political transformation of that area in that Congress organized the state of Minnesota, which you can see behind me. That's almost the full state lines on the left. How did people get to Minnesota at that time? They went on paddle wheelers up the Mississippi. And then down there, you see the state seal, which has some meaning to this presentation. It says the North Star, and what you can see here is a farmer breaking the land with a plow, and an Indian riding off into the sunset. Where did those people go? Well, it just seemed like a natural order of things. What happens when Minnesota is organized as a state? About 1 year later, the Episcopalians get together in their annual conference and say, now that we've got a state, we need a bishop. They have this contest, and names are put in, and no one gets a majority. But there's one name that keeps getting thrown in the pot, and that's Henry Whipple, who is a rector in Chicago ministering to railroad men. And finally, this group of Episcopalians in their convention in St. Paul, Minnesota, someone says, hey, wait a minute, one of us here has been throwing in the name of this Henry Whipple. I don't think anybody here knows, except for that one person, who Henry Whipple is. So, who's doing that? So the man who had been putting in Whipple's name raised his hand and said, look, I've heard about this guy. He is really energetic. He is really something. He's a New York native. He's come west with his family. He's married. He's got 6 kids. And he just works around the clock. And he's been known for really, really good work among railroad men, bringing them to church, bringing them to Christ. And so everybody heard this, and the convention said, this sounds great. And the next round of vote was unanimous. The thing is, nobody had told Whipple that his name was going to be in the pot. And one person went down from St. Paul to, caught him coming back from church in Chicago and said, Bishop. And Whipple said, what? And they laid out before him that he'd been elected bishop in Minnesota. Now you got to think it over. So he did for a few days and decided that Minnesota was where God wanted him. And he went to Minnesota with his family in the winter of 1859. And he made a trek all through Minnesota at a time when Minnesota is at its best, absolutely frigid and freezing. But he was charmed by the people he met. And he also came to the conclusion that if he took this job, which, well, actually he had by then, he was going to be the bishop of all people in Minnesota. He was going to be the bishop for white settlers. He was going to be the bishop for new immigrant groups that came in. He was going to be the bishop for Indians, which was really a radical proposition at the time. Now, being the bishop for Native Americans, in particular the Sioux, who were dominant in Minnesota, particularly southern Minnesota, meant taking up their cause. One of the things that Whipple discovered early on was that when the federal government engaged in treaties, particularly with these northern Indians, something happened to the money that was supposed to be paid out year in and year out. And the Indians who had traded their land for an annuity plus basic tools to make themselves farmers, as official Washington wanted, were often being, somehow the money and the tools never got to them. And it was easy to see why. Because the Bureau of Indian Affairs, the agency in Washington that was supposed to oversee the transfer of this material and the money, was completely corrupt and was known at the time as a great job in which he could make a lot of money illegally and retire very comfortably after 5 years. Whipple was horrified by what he saw, and he began immediately, outside of his pastoral work with whites in Minnesota, he began immediately to write to Washington, various people in Washington. And he also began to send in letters to the editor of the newspapers, and he began to preach about it. Now, it was for him a belief in justice, and he wanted equality, essentially, for Native Americans and for the whites in Minnesota. It would be equality before God. To deprive people of their legally, their legal goods, the annuity, and also the tools that would come as part of these treaties, was really an offense to God, he believed. You can't steal from people, particularly if you promise them the money and the tools that are going to transform their lives. Now, let me show you what really was at stake here. If you can see the colors in the map right there are two major tribes in Minnesota. And the one that we're concerning ourselves with is the kind of beige yellow in the southern part of Minnesota. That belonged to the Dakota Sioux. And it's about 5 million acres. And in what was happening by the 1840s was that there was such an influx of white settlers into what was then Minnesota Territory that the economy, the hunting-gathering economy on which these Indians depended, began to collapse because they were simply, they couldn't compete with white farmers and white hunters. And so a movement arose among the Indians to accept an offer from the federal government in 1851 to sign away almost all of their lands in return for an annual annuity of gold and also farming implements. In return, the Indians would be given a temporary reservation, which I'll point out to you. I'm sorry, it's back on the other slide. I don't know if you can see this, but this is, all of this was their land. This is the reservation here. It's 10 miles on either side of the Minnesota River. Well, economically, that was only going to work if the Indians got their annuity and got their tools every year. It started out to work okay, but then by 1861, the Civil War had come along, and it became much more difficult for Congress and various cabinet offices in Washington to pay much attention to their obligations. And so the money and the tools that were to come to the Sioux didn't show up on any schedule. And this became a problem with the Indians, who began to realize how fragile their situation was. They were cut off from their hunting lands. They didn't have the tools to create farms, and they began to grow increasingly restless. Whipple took note of this, and as I say, he would write to the congressional delegation in Minnesota. He tried to write to the president, who at that time was James Buchanan. He even went to Washington to see one of the cabinet secretaries who told him essentially nothing we can do about it. So he goes back to Minnesota and begins a sort of a one-man movement, a campaign. He is going to write from here on out to everyone and make them see that there are two issues here. One is that breaking treaties, breaking legal obligations is offensive to God. Two, on a practical level, if you do this, if you mistreat these native populations, you are going to run a risk of danger, because sooner or later there's going to be a backlash against white authorities, and Whipple desperately wanted to head that off. Now, who was important in this? One of the key people, and not the head chief, we didn't really have those in the Dakota lands there. One of the singly important people was a man named Little Crow, who was a descendant of prominent men within the Dakota Sioux line. And he was a man who was willing to work very closely with white authorities to to head off any tension. He was extremely well spoken. He kind of came across as a little noble figure. And he was the man kind of in the middle who was balancing the government and its promises with younger men in the tribe who became increasingly restless about the erosion of the system by which the Indians would receive their goods. I'll show you our other man here. You can get a sense that he's kind of betwixt and between two cultures. On the left, he's wearing basically Western clothes, and on the right, he's in full Dakota Sioux dress. Both those pictures were shot in Washington, to which he went on a couple of occasions to talk to people in the Bureau of Indian Affairs and the Interior Department about speeding up and regularizing the treaty obligations that the federal government had with Dakota. There's our Bishop Henry Whipple, born in 1822 in Adams, consecrated as a bishop in 1859. After he decided that he would indeed take the job as bishop, he went to the last Episcopal General Convention before the Civil War and was consecrated in the Episcopal Cathedral in Richmond the very week that John Brown's raid took place on Harper's Ferry. So some of the people in that convention got on their horses and rode to Harper's Ferry to support the Virginia militia against John Brown. Whipple, as I say, continues a lobbying activity, warning that even though the government is going to be preoccupied by the Civil War, he wants people to focus on what danger could happen on the northwest frontier in Minnesota. And he continues writing. He finally, in the early part of 1852, gets an answer from Lincoln, who says, look, I appreciate your writing, and it's important that what you've raised here, I will gladly pass it on to people in the Interior Department and the Bureau of Indian Affairs to consider this. Whipple is overjoyed. He's broken through to the president, but he doesn't really see how what Lincoln is doing at this point is going to help, so he's got to figure out a way for himself to get to Washington and speak face-to-face with the president, and also to tell him that there's got to be a sweeping change in the Department of Indian Affairs. It's totally corrupt. It's got to be cleansed in some ways. Put in a civil service, or put it under the control of sort of, he's got this idea that you can get disinterested, important men from around the country who could keep an eye on it and make sure that they're not corrupt people running that bureau. Whipple's ideas make sense. They seem, he does get good feedback from some people in high places, and as I say, he does get a positive letter from Lincoln, but things don't move fast enough. And one of the, as I said, one of the problems that Little Crow the Dakota Sioux chief faced is that the younger men were getting increasingly restless. And in the summer of 1862, the gold, the annuity, the tools for farming just never showed up. And no one from Washington could explain it. And the local Indian agents, that is, people working for the government on the ground in Minnesota, had no explanation. And not only that, they were not even generous. They had warehouses full of food. They had tools. They didn't have the money, but the Indians were not going to get anything until the annuity came up from Washington, and they said so. These are the Indian agents speaking to the Dakota leaders, and of course undermining the authority of Dakota leaders like Little Crow, who could have served and often did as go-betweens between federal officials and younger men. What happens? Well, on the 17th of August, 1862, there are some very young men who go off the reservation and go hunting, and they come up empty, and they are hungry, and they are on their way back, and they get into an argument, as hungry young men sometimes can. And the argument degenerates to who is most afraid of white settlers. And nobody is most afraid of white settlers. And what comes out of that argument is an attack on a small settlement and the flight of these young men back to the reservation. So they've spread the news, look, we've killed several white settlers, now what are we going to do? And what happens is there's enough tension and enough anger and enough disappointment has built up among the Dakota at this time that there's a faction that decides to go to war. And they do the very next day, the 18th of August in 1862, they unleash a war that is aimed primarily at civilians, although there are some military installations in Minnesota. There are not many because most of Minnesota's men have gone to fight for the Union Army in the Civil War. You have a painting down here, I don't know how clearly you can see it, but this typifies what was going on in terms of the war itself. You had bands of young men under the leadership of minor chiefs who attacked homesteads throughout southern Minnesota, and it was a very brutal set of circumstances, and it was very confusing too, because there were some Indians some of the Dakota were very much into making war, some were horrified by it, and did what they could to save, and did actually save white families. And in the meantime, rumor and fact had such an impact on many settlers that they began simply fleeing their farmsteads and heading for St. Paul, heading for any city they could to get off the plane. Up here is the only photograph of the entire Dakota War. What it shows is families who are spread out in one spot, camping as they flee towards St. Paul, flee across the state. Well, when this happened, the state authorities in Minnesota panicked and began sending messages, telegraph and such to Washington, to the Secretary of War, to Lincoln, to others, saying the whole state is going to collapse. We've got this tremendous rising, it's totally brutal, and people are uprooting themselves and they're fleeing east, and we fear for the future of Minnesota. Lincoln has a general that he doesn't know quite what to do with, so he sends him up there to a man named John Pope to have a closer look, and Pope echoes the state officials. In the meantime, where is Whipple? Whipple had just come off of a camping trip, visiting another tribe in northern Minnesota. He gets as far as St. Paul. The day that the Dakota Rebellion breaks out, the governor of Minnesota, who knows Whipple, tells him to go further south in the state and raise up a militia, which Whipple does. So he's got to, he understands his responsibility. He's basically under the authority of the governor. So he goes down to a town called Faribault, where he is settled and built a cathedral, and he spreads the word that the state needs a militia, and he sends them on their way. At the same time, he decides to go with some local volunteers who have set up a hospital about 20 miles away near the frontier, a hospital that will accept wounded among the white settlers who are pouring in from the west. He spends a week acting as a doctor in the hospital under the authority of a couple of medical people. During that time, he also manages to accidentally stab himself in the hand with an infected needle, so he can't write for a while, but he can travel. And he goes on from the front lines, he goes to Washington and follows through on what he plans to do. He had written to a couple of people he knew in Lincoln's cabinet, and he gets to Washington on about the 15th of September. He knows that Lincoln has received lots of panicky letters and such from people out on the frontier, from the governor out there, and from various military officials. But he also realizes that he has an advantage here, that he will be the first person that Lincoln will actually talk to face about the Dakota Rising. And what he does is Lincoln receives him. Whipple has prepared his speech. He knows exactly what he wants. He wants to say, this happened because of the intense corruption in the Indian Affairs Department. We don't want this to happen again. If we don't want this to happen again, we've got to clean out that department, get rid of all the corrupt people, and have people working for the interests of peace and the interests of Native Americans there. Lincoln listens to him all the way through, and finally they break off. Lincoln tells a joke just to relieve the tension there. Whipple feels satisfied, but one thing that's happened, that happens over the next 2 days, is he does some research in Washington about the treaties that had not been held up in the Midwest. Is a very important battle takes place, the Battle of Antietam in western Maryland. It's Robert E. Lee's first invasion of the North. And when Whipple hears that, he heads straight for the battlefield because he knows that there are Minnesota men involved, and he also has a friend who would have been leading the Union Army, a man named George McClellan, who was a top general of the Union Army. Lincoln, of course, also hears this and waits by the telegraph to hear the outcome of the battle. The battle is narrowly won by the Union. And what this means is that Lincoln had promised himself quietly, and he didn't mention this to anybody in his cabinet until right after the Battle of Antietam. He had written out the Emancipation Proclamation before the battle, and had made a pact with God that if the Union could secure a victory, he would release the Emancipation Proclamation, freeing African American slaves. And so, let's see if we've got a picture of it here. There it is. That's Lincoln and the White House in 1862. But there we go. This is Lincoln reading the Emancipation Proclamation to his cabinet. The man on the right, clean-shaven, is William Seward, who had his house in Auburn. Up there is a little picture, probably the most famous picture of the aftermath of the Battle of Antietam, which was the single bloodiest day in American history in terms of casualties taken. Whipple went to the battlefield, spent a lot of time with wounded from Minnesota, and then went on to see General McClellan and prayed with him that night in McClellan's tent. Whipple went on to the Northern Convention of Episcopal bishops in New York and came to talk about what he thought needed to be done at this point. He'd spoken with the president. Now he wanted to get all the Episcopal bishops outside the South on his side in terms of advocating for a reform of the Indian Affairs Office. One of the things that strangely was part of church life in these days is that, at least in the Episcopal Church, they never took a stand on anything remotely political. That is, when secession came, the Northern Episcopalians said nothing about it. They said nothing about slavery. They were concerned purely with church, interchurch affairs. Whipple arrives at this meeting. One bishop comes up to him, listens to him, and says, "No, you're not going to bring politics into this meeting. We never do that." But somehow Whipple is able to persuade key people that there needs to be a statement by Episcopal bishops that can be sent to Lincoln to back up Whipple's appeal. And he does so persuade them. And while he's in New York, he begins raising money for the white settlers and raises a fair amount of money and then sends it on to the governor and says, "Please distribute this so people can purchase their property again and move back onto their lands." So he's a man in motion all the time. He gets back to Minnesota. This will wrap it up. At the end of November, what he finds when he gets back there is that the Dakota War has been over for about a month. And the Army, which has gone up there, and the militia have arrested about 303 Dakota men and have tried them. Usually trials lasting about 5 minutes, conducted exclusively in English, and have sentenced 303 of them to death, to be hanged at once in Minnesota. Whipple sees this, and he immediately writes to Lincoln. And he writes also to a senator who is close to Lincoln and says, "You can't do this. This is utterly barbaric, and it would stain the reputation of the United States forever. You cannot do it. Please apply some mercy in this situation." Well, Lincoln actually does in November. He writes to his military people in Minnesota and asks them to send him a list of all the names of the Indians, send him the total transcript, and so he can see how the trials went. And he does a complete review of all 303 who have been convicted in these military courts and decides there's solid evidence only for 38. And so he sends back his message and says, "You will hang no more than 38. There's nearly a rebellion in Minnesota at this time. People threaten Lincoln with saying, "You're going to lose all order here, and we will go and get all 303 and we'll hang them." But there's enough military order in Minnesota to prevent that from happening. In any case, what happens is on the 26th of December, the military does prepare for the execution of the 38 men whose names Lincoln allowed to go forward. And there is a mass hanging in the city of Mankato. You can see the gallows right there. And those who weren't hanged are put into a winter camp under the guns of a military facility called Fort Snelling, from which they'll be expelled from the state in the next spring. Whipple tries to get down to the hanging. He misses it by a day because his wagon breaks down. But he goes the day after the hanging and he preaches in the Episcopal Church in Mankato, saying that there are two terrible wrongs that afflict the United States at this point. One is slavery, and the other is theft of land and property from the Indians. He's also an outspoken man. I regard him as a man of showing great Christian courage. People were furious at him for a long time in Minnesota, and his life was threatened. But he survived all this, and after a while actually became rather respected, and remained bishop until he finally passed away in 1901, just short of the age of 80, where he was celebrated across the country by then, because he was a man who was seen as having foresight and compassion. I've tried to put all this in one book. I think I've done a better job of actually writing it than I have of speaking, because it can get so complex, something like this. So much happens, and yet it was a time of just fascinating characters. Some people real charlatans, and some people really noble and admirable. And I could probably answer a few questions about that now, but that's the gist of it. And I'm grateful to those of you who made a contribution to church missions by picking up one of the books that I brought over there. Is there any? Yeah, Jack.
Gustav, could you tie in Custer's last stand with the suit, how the uprising wrote on that last stand situation?
Yes. What happens after, in the spring of 1863, is that the Dakota Sioux from Minnesota are deported from Minnesota, and they're sent to some pretty scrubby land in what was called Dakota Territory, now is North and South Dakota. And they can't make much of a living there. People begin to die off. And one of Whipple's priests goes with them, and he reports that things are really dreadful up there. Not only are they sort of sent into this primitive living situation, but some of the federal military decide that the only way really to make sure they don't come back is to go fight them in the Dakotas. And what you've got after that, 1863, is you've got 13 years leading up to Custer's invasion of Montana, in which there's just regular fighting between the various Dakota factions and federal troops.
Question is it possible that the behavior of the government and the behavior of the Organization of Indian Affairs did perform their actions on purpose, with the sole purpose of actually pushing the American Indian so far that they attacked the white folk in their area, thus obliging the government to attack them as well? Is it possible that it was just part of an idea of let's push them until they cannot take it anymore, and then we can go get them legally?
I'm sure some people thought that way, and it would certainly make sense. I mean, the people who wound up in Indian affairs, by and large, did not like Indians. And they did things that were really offensive, including not enforcing the law that would protect Indians, including Indian women who were often abused by individual hunters and people who got into the Indian territory. It makes me want to just see if I can find something in which Little Pro becomes very, very eloquent and tries to stop the war before it starts. And you can tell, though I'm not sure I can find it, what he is up against as an Indian leader. He's got to somehow keep his status by reflecting the concerns of people in the tribe, and yet at the same time he knows how dangerous any sort of armed response against settlers or federal troops would be. He's a very well-traveled person. He's been to Washington twice. He's been up to Boston. He's been to Niagara Falls, as many chiefs at that time had been when they had dealings with white authorities. But he said, look, you guys, this is on the night before the war. He said, I'm here to tell you that if you go out and kill soldiers and settlers here now, you're going to have thousands of soldiers, more than you could ever imagine, pouring in here, and they're going to take our land completely. They will kill us. They'll kill your families. There will be no mercy. And then back and forth, and finally the Little Pro essentially throws ashes in his hair and says, all right, you want me to go with you? I'll go with you, but we're all committing suicide. Do you understand that? Really, really dramatic scene. And so, what's that?
Page 42 and 43.
42 and 43?
See if this is part of what you're looking at.
put some lights on?
Yeah, here's what he says. This is Little Crow's final speech, which was memorized by his teenage son who stood by him as he spoke it. What happens is he sat before men who wanted blood and wanted him with them when they spilled it. The argument raged on, tempers rising until nearly sunrise. Finally, one young man, impudent with excitement, dared to call Little Crow a coward. The insult cut the chief deeply. He struck his accuser, knocking the man's feathered headdress to the floor. He then let loose the oratory that had for years served him as a revered spokesman among the Dakota Sioux. He called the younger men fools and accused them of being drunk. Listen, he said, quote, the white men are like locusts when they fly so thick that the whole sky is a snowstorm, close quote. The Dakota might kill many, but that would not restore the past. Kill 1, 2, 10, and 10 times 10 come to kill you. Count your fingers all day long, and white men with guns will come faster than you can count. As Little Crow spoke, his son Wowanapi stood at his side, memorizing the speech. He would recall his father in a spirit of lamentation, pronouncing the young men blind and deaf to his sagacity. You cannot see the face of your chief. Your eyes are full of smoke. You cannot hear his voice. Your ears are full of roaring waters. Little Crow, who until very recently had held the office of speaker for the tribe, summoned a natural eloquence to talk them out of further violence. He predicted they would surely die, quote, like the rabbits when the hungry wolves hunt them down in winter. But Little Crow would join them, he said, and in doing so, he said he expected to die too. And he did. Thank you, David.
Thank you.
The book it's better written than I can speak. I took some time and I had some fun writing that book. Yes?
Well, we sent a slip around for you to sign if you wish to buy the book. I don't know whether it's gotten all the way around.
I'd be happy to sign anybody who took a book.
Back over here, and you can sign up.
Mr. Lindsey?
Gustav, thank you so very much. This is incredible. When I was in the Midwest at a church in Wisconsin, the Synod of the Presbyterian Church had the Dakota Presbytery, which is one of the few racial ethnic federations that's left. And the issue that Gustav's describing is still present today, that there's different cultures. And as Westerners, as North Americans, we have assumptions as to how things are supposed to be done. We take minutes, we have moderators, we pass those on and have them read by other people. In the Dakota, it was an oral culture. So at their Presbyterian meetings, they would have a vote taken and elect Gustav to be moderator. And at the next month's meeting, they would accuse Gustav of being a heretic and have him removed and put Mario in instead. And there's no minutes. So there's no written record of this. And at the next month, they accuse Mario of being a heretic and putting Gustav in. And going back and forth. And the third culture is the church. And the church represents an entirely different culture than either the Western European or the Dakota as being coming out of Scripture and the authority of God. And as we've worked with the South Sudanese, and as we continue in our own culture to deal with generational changes, we're always dealing with those cultures in tension and the church wrestling with that as well.
If I might just add one last thing about the church. Oh, sure. Let me add this, then I'll take your question. I just wanted to say that the young man I mentioned, Wowanapi, Little Crow's son, he was arrested. His father was killed in a skirmish the next year, 1863, and Wowanapi was arrested essentially and sentenced to death. But after a year in prison, federal authorities decided we don't really have anything that we want to do with this young man, so we'll release him. He went on to school, became ordained as a Presbyterian minister, and became known throughout the Midwest as a major founder of YMCAs. You never can tell. By the way, the missionaries were really sort of, they saw things with nuance out there that often eluded others. Presbyterians were great in developing a written Dakota language. Bill?
Did Whipple get involved at all in the Indian affairs corruption during the Grant administration?
That's a really good question. He had respect for Grant, and what happened was he continued to press in authorities in Washington, including the Grant administration, with his ideas. He said the best thing you could do is to get a board of disinterested businessmen to oversee that Bureau of Indian Affairs. But things really didn't seem to start working out until after Grant, until the administrations after Grant. But by then, we're getting toward the end of the days in which Indians are in a position for any negotiation.
Good stuff. Thank you very, very, very much.